Ladies and gentlemen, we are back. Well, I guess we're back kind of every day. That's kind of a really weak intro. Let's say, ladies and gentlemen, we're here for another installment, another version, we're back for an Ask That. Today, we're going to have a fun conversation with a lady, none other by the name of Rizchel Dayao. My name is Clark Sell. And this is Ask That. Rizchel,
Hello.
I was really worried about biffing up your name, but I think I pulled it off.
You got it right.
I
You're
got
good.
it. I could the rest of the day smooth sailing.
Yeah.
Uh,
Our
thank
time's over.
That's right. Thank you for being here. Let's start with who you are.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be on the show or podcast, whatever you want to call it.
I'm not sure
Yeah.
what we call this little space.
Yeah. So my name's Rizchel. I'm currently a developer advocate at IBM. I was previously a front-end developer. I think that's where my passion really lies.
Sure.
Now I just work where our particular team oversees containers and Kubernetes. So now I just get to deploy my front end application with Kubernetes, which is a good skill to know too. I know how to, push out my applications now. So it's pretty cool.
I was going to say Dockerize all of the things. Let's throw them all in little jars and just throw them around.
Yep.
So let's dive into this a bit. I think it's an interesting world of Docker and serverless and Kubernetes and swarms and Reacts and whatnot. So let's start a bit in the front and kind of move back. So you said you're in the world of front end development, and I know you did a lot of React stuff. So I kind of want to start with what's an application look like, and then how did you the deployment side of things? We'll kind of at some point we got to shove it somewhere.
Yeah.
So let's start with the front end. What does a typical front end for you look like?
Yeah. So my last couple projects I've been doing, and this is at IBM and side projects, was
Okay.
React. I learned React at IBM. So when we first started this project, so it's only been, maybe a year or so
Sure.
that I've been working in it, but it's the hot new thing, especially at IBM. Everyone wants to know it. So that's
Okay.
why we basically used it.
Okay.
So typically our architecture is we use React and then we have Redux to control state,
Sure.
global state, because we're
Good.
just dealing with a lot of data. If you think about specifically the IBM Cloud,
Yep.
we have a lot of incoming data, and then we need to post a lot of data too if we're creating
Sure.
virtual machines, Cloud Foundry apps, anything
Sure.
like that.
Sure.
And then we recently implemented a GraphQL middle tier.
Yep.
So before, it was a mess. It would just go to literally a microservice called Monolith.
Okay.
It
Well, of
was
course. I mean, that makes
Yeah.
total sense. I mean, why would your microservice not be called Monolith?
Yeah. Who wouldn't be a little, creeped out by
That's
that
right.
and scared? So, we got rid of that because it would go to Monolith. No one on our team had access to it. Someone who left IBM created it. And then it would just make a bunch of API calls that we didn't really need it to.
Sure.
So GraphQL, we just brought it in. It really made a middle tier, so back-end developers could work on the back end, front-end
Sure.
developers can work on the front end,
Sure.
and then each of the different microservices had its own data source. So
Sure.
all it had its own schemas, all
Okay.
the API requests it needed to. So that was, I guess, a typical architecture that we had. And then, of course, we had unit testing and whatnot, which isn't my particular favorite, but I know why we need it.
Well,
Yeah.
my story with unit testing is always this: if I can unit test the hell out of something, so that I can turn it over and walk away and then be
Yeah,
my hands are clean, I'm out,
exactly.
I'm on to the next thing.
Yeah, when I switched teams, I was our unit test is over 80%. So, which
Oh
was
yeah,
we were trying to. So you're good. You're
yeah, that's
good.
right. I'm totally out. So graph wise, because I know I love the graphness. What were you using? Raw graph because you mentioned Redux, so were you using the Facebook's raw graph implementation, or were you using something like Apollo?
We were using the Apollo client to interact with GraphQL. So it was my first time working with that client. It was really cool because it has an interface so you could do local data as well.
Yep.
So I know on that team, our eventual goal, and I mean probably not goal, more like a wish list was that IBM Cloud could eventually become all offline.
Sure. So, of course.
I don't know if that's
Right.
gonna happen,
Like
but
local. Back
yeah.
in the old days where we had sure ran servers on our boxes.
Yeah. So, I mean, that was really cool. But yeah, we were using Apollo Client for a lot of it. And then for performance-wise too, Apollo Client caches a lot of the
Yep.
queries. So
Yep.
if you're just switching views, if you're not re-rendering a page, but if you're just
Right.
switching views, that's really good because the particular pages we were working on could take 45 seconds to load.
Sure. Okay, so we got React. We're using some transport in the middle, and then we've got a series of, or a graph endpoint, or a series of endpoints in the back. So then, really, Siri? That was just odd.
Triggers.
Yeah, that's a new one for me. So then let's talk about the server side. So now there's some decisions to be made. Obviously deploying the React site itself, and then whatever backends. You mentioned Kubernetes in this kind of world, and I think this is where the conversation starts to get fun. Not that the front end's not fun, but in this world of serverless / containers, how much bloodshed happened between teams on what's really the right way of doing something like this?
So as far as for the enterprise project I worked on, we had a DevOps team.
Okay.
So they kind of made all the decisions themselves, and we didn't see any of that. We were kind of just told, hey, we're migrating to Kubernetes. This is what's going to happen. This is what you need to do. So from that front, I didn't get to see that much, and I didn't kind of get to see, the back and forth and whatnot. But I'm sure there definitely was.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah, there always is. So from my perspective, just to kind of learn how it worked, I deployed one of just my React side projects. Very simple, super simplistic. It just calls one API point. It's so basically you input a movie title, and then it just comes back with a JSON object. So it's super simple, but just to kind of get an idea, in the real world, you wouldn't use Kubernetes for that simple of an application.
Sure. Yeah, totally.
It is more for enterprise, and if you're going to have a lot of people visiting your site. But yeah, so I started getting into that. I learned YAML files are everywhere for Kubernetes, so I didn't realize that, but I was
Yes.
wow. So
Yes. Google likes their YAML files.
yeah. So, but yeah, so I just deployed really simple, just to a certain port, and then just with a node port. So next I want to dive into load balancers, because those are probably a lot, they help probably more with traffic and everything, but just for simplicity's sake.
Sure.
And all the tutorials just had node ports. So I just went ahead with that.
So for those who may not know, let's put a definition around what Kubernetes really is.
Yeah. So basically Kubernetes is a tool that you can use to deploy your applications, but they also kind of manage it. So they do a lot of the automating for, scalability and whatnot. So I think, compared to maybe, if you're doing a Cloud Foundry app, you're not going to get those automations and that automatic scalability and just maintainability that you get with Kubernetes. So how I've done it is with Docker, I first containerize the application, and then with that, then I deploy that containerized application to Kubernetes, and then it goes out into the internet and people can all see it.
So fair to say that Docker is the underlying container, and Kubernetes is you're shoving Docker containers into Kubernetes, and Kubernetes is doing some magic over the top of it to make it scale, manage, do its management goo.
Yeah, yeah. So from my understanding, once it's deployed, like from a user perspective, um, you don't have as much as involvement in it.
Sure.
And then I also got into Istio a little bit.
What's that?
So Istio, it kind of goes hand in hand with Kubernetes. So it's kind of a proxy to Kubernetes. So you have your microservice or your containerized application and Kubernetes, right? And Istio kind of goes in between them. So it'll so it's called a service mesh,
Okay.
which is where you have like all your containerized applications, and Istio goes over all of them. So between your different microservices that you have, it'll do like security. It'll do security measures. It can handle A/B testing. So let's say if you only want like 70% of your users to go to version A and 30% to go to version B, it can handle that. Authentication. What else did it do?
It doesn't, I mean, at first glance, it kind of sounds like a load balancer, but I don't think that that's really what it is, or at least I've never heard of it. So is it like I don't know, a facade or a middleware? I don't even want to say middleware because it doesn't even sound like middleware. What kind of wear is this? Is it underwear, outerwear, overwear?
So it's still in your DevOps pipeline.
Okay.
So it still resides in that. But it goes in between. So you have your deployment and you have your applications, and Istio kind of covers all of your applications, which is called a service mesh. So if you have, an application that's only going to be one container, then that one container is your service mesh. If you have 5 microservices that are all containers, Istio will go over all of them. So it's so I think it handles more of the communication between those microservices and adds like more security measures. And there's a bunch of other stuff it does too.
Is it its own container?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you configure it so you have everything working with Istio, and then it does the magic routing in between?
Yeah, so you'll have to add, of course, more YAML files.
Of course.
So like for security, you'd have a YAML file if you want to do A/B testing. Another thing it does is you can do it for particular testing with traffic. So if you want to just like load, like send a bunch of traffic to one microservice to see how it would work and run, you can kind of use it for that as well.
Okay.
So it was like, it's still in beta. It was actually created by IBM, Google, and Lyft, I believe.
Really?
So, yeah. So it was, but it's really new. So, I mean, it's in beta. So, like, when it does get released, it could be completely different, right?
Sure.
Sure.
So it's already changed in the last 5 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
So let's talk about Docker then first. I mean, you said you're starting to get into this, and I think this is always a fun time to like have that reflection on hindsight. Like, yeah, I'm learning this, and it's not quite what I thought it was going to be, or yeah, it's pretty awesome. Like, let's start with Docker because it seems like that is the center of the onion, if you will. Have you found yourself like leveraging Docker now in new and crazy scenarios? Because Docker's obviously pretty awesome.
Not so much. I probably should be. So I kind of learned Kubernetes and Docker, and being a developer advocate, we have to travel on stuff. So it's kind of a balancing act between like, when can I code and actually like do these cool new things to like speaking. So I kind of just learned it, but I haven't really been able to like apply it much more than that. But I definitely want to.
Have you messed around with Compose yet?
No, but I've heard, of Docker Swarm and everything, so I definitely want to dive into that and check it out.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
Yeah, but I found for like Docker and Kubernetes, I found the Docker, like just containerizing your application was super easy. The Kubernetes was not.
Right.
But
all right. So
I was like, great.
How not? Like, where was the oh my?
Yeah, so I used IBM for Kubernetes. So first of all, like it stinks, but there's not as much documentation to get it out there. So it was just like hard just to find it in the first place. But then just like with all the commands and stuff, like there's a lot of information that you're inputting to get a specific like configuration. So the YAML files for the longest time, I was like, these like are confusing the heck out of me. So I actually found a way to avoid having to create a YAML file and just deploying with like commands. And then I think I was almost at the point where I got deployed, and it was one of those things where it's like really simple bug why it wasn't getting deployed. Like it's kind of like, oh my gosh. But in my Docker file and my command I did for Kubernetes, I put different ports on them.
Yep.
So, and then I fixed that, and I was like, great. So it was one of those things where it's like, okay, it's really tiny, but like for half a day I was working on it. Why isn't it working? Yeah, and then someone on my team who like I would say he's probably like a Kubernetes. He's pretty good at Kubernetes. I was like, can you just help me? And he found it in like 5 seconds.
So do you like Kubernetes? I mean, you're certainly like a front end developer type.
Yeah.
Not to paint stereotypes because that's horrible.
Yeah.
But Kubernetes is like super server DevOpsy, like run my containers. Like I don't want to have to deal with that.
Yeah, I am starting to. So everyone else on my team is like in DevOps or backend developers. So they're definitely explaining more to me on like why it's important and why it is like interesting. But like from my perspective, so I'm starting to look into this new thing, like project, I guess, to work on. So, as a front-end developer, like we don't want to focus on deploying something, but if you're in a small company, you're responsible of that too.
Yeah, unfortunately.
So, yeah. So you're kind of responsible for everything. So I think like I can definitely relate to those front-end developers. So now I'm trying to work on a project where like you can just deploy with like a Slack integration. Because then like as a front-end developer, that's it. Like you're like, okay, cool, my stuff's out. So yeah, so I mean I like it. I understand why it's important and stuff. But I mean I'm not like ecstatic about it.
Yeah, well, yeah. It's like taxes. You're like, yeah, it's important, and I have to pay it, and I hate it.
Yeah.
Although that's probably dependent upon what state you live in. So, in Illinois, we like to pay taxes on everything.
Texas, there was no income tax, and then I moved to Colorado, and I was like, man, this is really sad.
Yeah, but in Colorado, you could just go down to your local dispensary, smoke a little bit, and then be completely fine that you paid all those taxes.
You're like, I'm okay now.
Yeah, taxes, totally fine. All right, so Kubernetes, you said, now I understand why it's important. Why? Why?
Yeah, well, like those things I kind of said before. Well, okay, I guess this kind of does sound like a front-end developer perspective, though. Like, I understand because I could just be like, hey, do a bunch of automation and kind of handle my application out there.
Hey, that's important.
Yeah. So I guess that, and then like, you don't have to worry about like scaling it if you're, if on one particular day you're, there's going to be like a lot of traffic, like it can handle a lot of that by itself. So I think that's really nice. So for me, like I can actually focus on like the code and building something cool.
Sure. I mean, so I run a small company of one. Is there? I mean, we like Travis. I love Travis CI. It makes it very easy to CI all the things and push them in places and deployment pipelines and whatnot. I mean, in the case of React, I mean, find a CDN. I assume the Kubernetes stack for you guys is much more of the back end than it is the front end. And so, which, although also important, what does the build pipeline look like? I mean, you mentioned you have a DevOps team, so obviously there's more resources than, my little company, but are you using a tool like Travis to build the containers, or what's that pipeline look like? Because
Yeah.
Slack's great and all, but and I live in
Yeah.
it too much, but I also don't want somebody accidentally like deploy, like production, like oops.
Well, yeah. So I wouldn't just like deploy, yes, because that's dangerous. So we do have Travis. We use Travis as well. So it's for all our PRs, and then whenever it gets merged too. And then
Okay.
we also use Jenkins. So I don't know as much about Jenkins, but we do use Jenkins for our deployments. So
Why the difference? Like, why use two different tools?
I don't know the
History.
DevOps. So
Same
specifically for
same
Travis,
code branch using two different CI
um,
tools.
so for Travis, so basically each microservice, I guess can choose their own continuous integration tool. I mean, I think most of them do use Travis.
Okay.
So that's more within like so I guess like as front-end developers or whatever, like just as a developer in that microservice, like we were like, okay, IBM has an enterprise Travis account, we'll just use that. And then just to make sure like testing's good, linting, just make sure
Yep.
all that. So from like a team maintainability, we implemented Travis. The DevOps team implemented Jenkins. So that's for any of our deployments. So we deploy every Thursday.
Okay.
So like anytime anything gets deployed up to production, then the Jenkins will run. So we don't get much exposure to that. We kind of focus on Travis, like, hey, as long as everything's, running,
Interesting.
getting what it needs to, that's what we make sure with. So yeah, so like if for that project I was working on, I would make sure it went through like Travis or something, not just like, oh, deploy, whatever. Let's
That's
see what.
interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Is there excuse me, is there any building of containers and putting those containers up on the Docker's I don't know, Docker's cloud and pulling those versions of containers down?
I don't think so. I think it's
Interesting.
mostly in the IBM Cloud.
Well, no, I guess fair enough. But
Yeah.
but building that container, versioning it, shipping it somewhere, and then composing, I need this microservice container X, and I need
Oh,
this
I see.
one X. That's really where I was going.
So IBM has a service called IBM Container Registry, which is kind of like our version of Docker.
Sure.
So
Yeah, I
I'd
couldn't
imagine.
come up with the name of it, but registry is that's a good
Yeah,
one.
yeah. So that's probably where all of that, I would assume,
Sure.
all that magic happens.
And does that happen in the Travis stuff too, or strictly in
No,
the Jenkins
no.
build?
So that'll only happen in Jenkins. So Travis is
Interesting.
more, just
Interesting.
making sure that the code is good and
Sure.
can then move on to the Jenkins stuff.
Sure. What's been some of your biggest like aha moments learning?
So I had a big aha moment with React.
Yeah?
Yeah. So when I first started, we were working with this team that was pretty familiar with React already. So we kind of learned a lot of like our practices from them.
Sure.
And we were all still learning React, so I don't think anyone was like super like expert great at it. Anyways, what we first did, so you have containers and components in React. So usually containers contain more of like the logic and whatnot, and the component is just like, it's supposed to be a reusable component. You're supposed to be able to use it anywhere in the application, and it shouldn't handle logic outside of
Sure.
that component. That makes sense. Yeah, so we were doing it the opposite way on that team when I first learned React. So we were putting all the logic in the component, and in the container, it was just like very basic. So we were just listing all the components in there. So at first, like it was fine, but then these components started getting really complicated, and we couldn't reuse them because it would only be for a specific, like we could only use it in this place because this logic doesn't, apply to this other place that we need that component as. So that's where I first learned it. But on my next team that we were on, or our next project, I guess, I learned that it shouldn't be that way, and containers should have all the logic, and component should be just the component.
Interesting.
And that was my huge aha moment, because I was like, oh my gosh, this makes more sense. We can use this component like 5 places, and we don't have to worry about all this other logic.
That's interesting.
So, which I know some people do it the other way around or whatnot, but for me, like, that clicked in my head and it makes sense, and that's how I try and build everything else out now.
Sure.
So yeah, so I would say that's one big aha moment that I was like, this is great.
What about tools? Like what have been some of your favorite tools?
Um, so I really I started with Atom as my IDE, and
Yep.
now I'm using Visual Studio Code.
Yep.
And that has a lot of really cool perks within it. Like I like that you can have like the terminal inside
Yep.
of it. And then just like, yeah, so I really like that. It's helped me a lot with
Are
just
you
coding and not having to like redo a bunch of stuff. But
so
I was like new to Atom, so maybe I just didn't know like the shortcuts in Atom either.
yeah. I mean they're similar.
Yeah, yeah.
Codes. I'll give Microsoft props. It's come a long way. It was
Yeah.
in the beginning. It was super. I shouldn't say super. There was a lot of Microsoft isms that came out, and on a Mac that was like, it's just not
Not
like
gonna work.
no, it does. This doesn't work for me.
Mhm.
But that's since gotten worked out, and it's gotten a lot better. I mean, I use it every day, which that
Yeah,
got me off of Atom. I should say
yeah.
off, but I'm not using Atom at the moment. Um, what about, all right, since you're using code, let's talk about fun little tools inside of code. Are you an Emmet person?
No, no, I'm not an Emmet person.
Okay. What about favorite, I don't know, what do you call plugins? Add-ins, plugins?
And so we use Prettier, so that makes
Yeah.
it really easy to like just like, oh, I accidentally put a space there.
Yeah.
Let me just hit this and fix everything.
Yeah.
So that's been really nice. Other plugins do I use? Again, just having like the terminal in there, I think is really nice. Like I don't have to switch back and forth between my terminal, VS Code, and my browser. So
Sure.
I can just go right there and then
Sure. Sure.
have to go back and forth between two rather than one.
Sure.
I know there's other plugins I use. I just can't think of them off the top of my head right now.
It's okay. I got a stack of them. I mean, I am on this witch hunt is probably a bad word for it, but on this witch hunt to find everything that'll make my life one keystroke less or a little bit better. And, Prettier is exactly one of those. Like, I really
Yeah.
don't care. Airbnb, great. Prettier, great. Reformat my shit, great. Don't care. Like,
Yeah.
I just don't care.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean. Yeah, it's nice. It's like you just do it.
Please.
It's the same code anyways, just a little bit formatted differently.
That's
So,
right. I've even gotten to a point where it's kind of like the red squiggly underneath things. It's like, oh, I know it'll get fixed, so I'm just gonna make it wrong enough, right? It'll put the trailing slash on it. Boom, trailing slash, done. Moving on.
yeah. No, that's really nice. I love that one.
All right. So before my last question, at the end of every one of these shows, I like to extend extend a bit of gratitude and acknowledge you. And with that being said, I'd like to thank you for not just being here on today's show and sharing all of the goodness, but also for being out there in the community and the stuff that you've put together on your blog and your site and your GitHub repos. I was, of course, checking all of that out before our conversation. And so thank you for that. And thank you for being out there. Which brings me to my last question. And this may hit home a bit, but my question for you is, what piece of advice would you give to I'll say either men? No, what would you give to other ladies in tech? You work at a big enterprise, IBM. I think it's Bleed Blue, whatever,
Yeah.
IBM company. But what would you give to other ladies or men as advice?
Yeah, I think it's just like, don't be scared to stand up for yourself. It can be intimidating, especially starting in any company, big or small. Like it can be intimidating because everyone around you has a lot of experience, but you're going to bring a different perspective than anyone else has,
Yep.
at the table. And that's really important, for how you're going to architect a project, how you're going to connect with users, anything like that. So I would just say, like, just don't be afraid to voice your opinion. You're going to learn from it, and you're going to, contribute something really great. And just be yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I totally agree. Everybody has something to offer. Everybody has a different perspective on a thing. Everybody sees something slightly different, and we all too often get in code reviews or whatever, and people get defensive. And it's like we're all just trying to push the ball down the road. Like, let's just do it and have fun doing it. Exactly.
And like, either, like, if anything else, you're going to learn something from it.
Yeah.
So like, don't take it personal.
Right. And, there's two ways of learning. You may learn that there's a better way, or that this thing works different, or you may learn that that's not a way you want to do it. And it works both ways. Just because you learn something doesn't mean you necessarily have to use it.
Yeah. Exactly.
Experiences craft our future behavior. So.
Yep.
All right. With that being said, thank you everybody for watching this glorious edition of Ask That. I'd like to know what tools you use, although I think we've asked that the last few days. But if you're doing Kubernetes, Docker, pushing some stuff up, let's hear about your experience. Drop some questions or comments down in the notes below or the discussion below. Give us a thumbs up, subscribe. Rizchel, where do people find you?
So I am Rizchel Dayao on Twitter and GitHub if you guys want to follow me, or if you guys want to, have any questions, feel free to direct message me there.
Rock on. We'll do. We'll put some notes we'll put some links to some of the stuff that we talked about below. And with that, we're out.
Yeah. Bye.